On this video, I want to do an example of applying the scientific method so that when it's your turn to do it in class, you know exactly how to do it step by step and have like a guide to do it. So I suggest that you write things down and then make sure you do this. So you're going to start with your research question. And when you study erosion, of course, you're going to know that it's basically when the soil is removed by wind, water, or animals, or things like that. And there's a lot of things which will affect it. And maybe upon researching a little bit, you find out that one of the things is that when trees are cut down, their roots are no longer holding the soil in place, and then it tends to cause more erosion. So let's think you want to examine that to make sure that that's true. So you start with this broad question of what causes erosion. That's going to be your research question. But you have to turn that into a problem statement. And usually you're going to do that by first focusing on something more specific about the general topic. So in this case, let's focus on deforestation, or the cutting down of trees, and seeing if that has an effect on erosion. So what you can do then is ask yourself that if I want to find out what does basically cutting down trees due to erosion, then what I'm going to have to be measuring to answer that question. That's your first thing you do when you're starting to the scientific method. You get the question that you have and you ask yourself, what am I going to have to measure in order to answer that question? In this case, what do you have to measure to answer the question of what increases erosion? Right? You're going to have to measure the erosion, because that's what you're going to see, what's going to respond to whatever you're doing. Right? So that's going to be what we call the dependent variable, or the responding variable, or the thing that you measured. All right? It's usually at the end of your research question if you pay attention to it. The other thing is you're going to see is that what will be manipulated, what are you going to be changing in this experiment that's going to actually cause a change in what you're trying to measure. In this example that we're talking about, cutting down trees, right? So the cutting down trees might cause more erosion or not. We'll have to see. But basically the idea then is that what the independent variable, or the manipulative variable, is going to be the cutting down of trees. So the first thing you do when you start a scientific method is ask yourself, you know, what am I measuring to answer this question? What am I manipulating to answer this question? Which means you have to start the research question. Once you have the answers for those two things, then you're ready to set up what is called the problem statement, which is usually in this setup, the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. We figured out that the independent variable is going to be cutting down the trees, and the dependent variable will be erosion, or like how much soil is removed by the water and wind. So you could say it then, the effect of cutting down trees on erosion. So that you see, that is now sets you up to successfully develop an experiment. Now, the next thing you're going to do is go to do your research to understand the problem that you're trying to examine. There's 5 steps that you're going to do that. The first step is you're going to learn everything you can about the independent variable. Now, remember that our independent variable here was the deforestation, right? So the first thing I'm going to have to do then is learn everything there is to know about deforestation and how I could possibly change that. Of course, just cutting down trees. This one is easy. But in real life, when you're doing this in class, you're going to have to think about how can I manipulate this independent variable that I'm trying to examine. Sometimes it's a challenge to find out how to do it. Let's say, for example, you're trying to find out, you know, how light affects the growth of plants. How are you going to go about manipulating the intensity of the light? You know? So that's where the creativity comes in, to try to come up with a solution for that. And the dependent variable would be or erosion, which means I'm going to have to learn everything there is to know about erosion and how I could possibly measure the amount of erosion. So I can research what erosion is and how, you know, other scientists have gone about measuring erosion, or I can come up with some sort of explanation myself, some creative way of measuring the amount of erosion. And that is the first 2 things you do in the background. You're going to research everything there is to know about deforestation, research everything to know about erosion, research a way that you could possibly change the deforestation, research a way that you could possibly measure the amount of erosion. Once you got that down, then you should probably understand enough about both variables that you can possibly create a link between the 2 variables. So now you're trying to answer the question, how does deforestation affect erosion? And what does the science background, what is the science literature, what are the other science research say about that? So you ask that question and you go about to find the research to back up your thing. And then you have, of course, keep track of your sources and use valid sources to answer that. Then you're going to come up and think about it. As I researched the effects of erosion, I also learned that there are other factors that could affect erosion. Things like the amount of wind, the amount of rain, how steep the soil is, the types of plants, all of these things. And so I'm going to have to maintain those things constant. So now I'm going to have to research constants, or things which could also affect the dependent variable. So these are other variables which could also affect the erosion, but I don't want those variables to change because I want to make sure it's the independent variable that's changing on my experiment. So I got to know everything there is to know about these other variables and how these variables could possibly affect erosion, and I have to write about it in my background. Then I'm going to also research how can the levels of the independent variable affect the dependent variable. Is a little bit of deforestation worse or better than a lot of deforestation? Do you see what I'm going there? Once you do all of that, you should be ready with your background to understand enough of the problem to come up with a hypothesis, which is where you will create a link between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Your research in this case should have indicated that the more trees are cut down, the worse the erosion is, because the soil is basically losing the roots that are holding it down. But of course, you're not going to describe it in your hypothesis. You leave that for your background. All you do in your hypothesis is establish the relationship. So you say, if there's more deforestation or the more trees are cut down, the more erosion will happen. That you're ready for the first 3 steps of the scientific method having completed, and now from here on you go to actually design your experiment.